Yes, it is my great privilege to come here and to meet you and also to deliver this lecture. Thank you very much for inviting me, and also thank you for your kind introduction. I'm afraid that I don't have nice pictures. Usually we do have a nice pictures during the lecture. But I will just read out from my notes. And again, this is quite rather long paper, but I would like to read out, and some of them are just to explain what I meant to say. So the title of my lecture is Christianity and Social Justice, the Search for the Common Good from the Perspective of Public Theology. Perhaps the term public theology is not that familiar to the audience here. So I thought of explaining public theology, but rather than spending time to that, I'll leave it to the questions later on. I would like to straight into the topic of justice, social justice, and the public theology. Throughout church history, although the church has often been the side of the state endorsing its policies, Christians have also been among the chief critics in defense of justice for the poor and marginalized. One of the most significant developments of the questions of social justice is the active articulation of the common good in theological circles. Various academic disciplines have recently drawn attention to the problem of determining the common good in democratic societies in the context of what we will call majoritarianism. The relatively new theological discourse of public theology has a dual emphasis on seeking justice and the pursuit of the common good, which could help us in the search for an understanding of the common good that respects minority interests. Public theology can be defined as critical, reflective, and reasoned engagement of theology in the public sphere for the sake of the poor and marginalized. So in this lecture, I shall first discuss some ideas from philosophy and social sciences on what constitutes justice for minorities and the poor in a society. And drawing on this wisdom, I shall discuss how public theology applies to minority rights. And then I shall then develop an approach to the common good in public theology that interacts both secular and theological concepts of the common good and can be implemented in democratic society to protect minorities. So my first point, democracy and the problem of majoritarianism. Democracy is founded on the idea that sovereignty lies with the people, and it is by the far most common form of government in contemporary states around the world. South African public theologian John de Kruijf points out that the relationship between Christianity and democracy has been ambiguous in that although he says that Christian faith has provided democratic values, historically, Christianity has often distanced itself from the system. However, he further comments that, especially after the experience of Nazism and Stalinist totalitarianism, most churches regarded democracy as essential to their vision of a just world order. The success of democracy was highlighted in the much-quoted thesis that liberal democracy is the end point of humankind's ideological evolution and the final form of the human government. Although that view, which was most clearly articulated by the Francis Fukuyama, was heavily criticized, Most commentators argue that democracy, for all its weaknesses, is still the best political system developed to date. However, there are some difficulties of the democracy, and there are some articles, particularly written in the Economics in 2014. Any democratic society is made up of different groups with a sectional interest. One of the weaknesses of democracy is that when it comes to forming a collective concept of common good and applying it, the view of the majority is determinative, and the opinion of minority is often ignored or suppressed. How to deal with a minority in any society or nation is a vital part of the healthy conduct of the government, but states, whether of liberal or social orientation, often fail to address the issue inadequately. In this lecture, I use minority not primarily in terms of numbers, but as a group of people who are poor, marginalized, and oppressed, or a people who do not have a socio-economic and political power, for example, as in the case of the Minjung in South Korea or Dalit in India. The question is what public theologians can contribute to solving the problem of majoritarianism in democratic systems. To do this, we'll first turn to theories of minority rights and the common good. So my second section is talking about theories of minority rights and the common good in the West, India, and China. How do we maintain the freedom and autonomy of individuals, groups, and nations, and yet protect vulnerable minorities in a democratic society or in a nation? The issue of justice for the minorities and at the same time pursuing of the common good for all in a democratic society has been an important concern for Western philosophers and political scientists. The concept of the common good or common interest, first articulated in the Western philosophy as early as Aristotle in his Politics, has been a central theory since it provides a framework for the relationship between the interest of individual and of community. Recently, the contribution of John Rawls on the issue of justice and the common good is his challenge to John Stuart Mill's use of utilitarian concept of justice, in which the common good was what suited the majority of the members of a society. Rawls saw justice as fairness, which derived by the rational choice of individuals in a fair setting, resulting in a distributive principle which benefits the lesser advantaged. His theory is based on the two aims. First, maximizing of the liberty of the individual, provided it does not impinge on others' freedom. And secondly, providing the advantaged people in the society with the best opportunities possible. His key arguments of fairness as a central component is sharper than notions of righteousness or equality, and which respects to the tensions between freedom and equality. His approach stressed fair process rather than only the result, which encourages participation of all individuals and groups in society. In responding to Rawls, Michael Sandel continues his theme of justice, for which he defines the key issues as first, maximizing welfare, second, respecting freedom, and third, promoting virtue. He points out that reflection is not the solitary pursuit, but a public endeavor, as it sees that we cannot discover the meaning of justice by introspection alone. In his support of Alasdair MacIntyre's virtue ethics and his own pursuit of communitarian concept of justice, he asks how it is possible to acknowledge the moral weight of community while still giving scope to human freedom, and answers by stressing the vital importance of seeking justice in the life of the common good. The key importance of Sanders' argument for our discussion of social justice and the common good is the transformation of the personal morality and social justice, which opens the possibility that religion can play a key role relating to the building of a good society. The problem of injustice requires not only just social structures, but also a change of hearts and change of minds. Sanders arguments that as well as a theoretical pursuit for the concern of concepts of justice and the common good, there must be a moral, ethical, and practical frameworks for the actualization of these ideas into a contemporary society is important in our discussion. While Western discussions on the concept of the common good focuses on the political systems and theoretical concept of justice, Indian thinkers have thought of more in terms of tolerance to accommodate the different communities of India, many of which are defined by faith. Tolerance involves a measure of respect and recognition of the other group. Such respect involves restraint, but does not result in any weakening of certainty, confidence, or commitment to our own beliefs and values. In the early 20th century, Radhakrishnan, the prominent Indian philosopher, challenged Western societies when he portrayed tolerance as a hallmark of Indian tradition and a sign of maturity, and insists that it should be adopted not as a matter of policy or expedience, but as a principle of spiritual life and a duty rather than a concession. He saw tolerance as based on the belief that every community has inalienable rights which others should respect, which should result in equal treatment for others' views. The meaning of tolerance was well articulated in Indian politics, that it is described as at once a pragmatic concept of living together and a philosophic concept of finding truth and goodness in every religion. Indian philosophers' arguments were not only influential at a cultural level, it contributed to the adoption in an independent India of a form of secularism in the context of multicultural and multi-religious society, where the state is called to ensure the equal treatment to various different communities. And discussing different difficulties of recognizing and incorporating minority rights in a state, and also drawing on the Indian model, Bhikkhu Parekh, the political scientist, points out that the minority groups should recognize their identities and also take full account of this into laws and public policies. But many of these face opposition from across the spectrum of political orientations. He discusses the two distinctively different political approaches of redistribution and recognition, and suggests that the best model for dealing with the issues should be an integral approach to the two, since this is the most advantageous. In his proposal of a new theory of justice, he argues that the differing views need to be acknowledged and understood, and that the issues between them are not always issues of justice, but rather to do with the differing values and ideas, and that therefore there is a need to negotiate with each other to seek the common good. Parek's argument is for a platform for interacting with one another for the pursuit of the common good, and creating a platform on which their voices may be heard is a crucial step in recognizing minorities, and one which public theology seeks to provide. Now, moving into the Chinese tradition, the Chinese philosophy, particularly Confucianism, has developed the idea of Ren, the benevolence. Here, you need to excuse me, please. My pronunciation of Chinese. I will just combine with the Korean pronunciation as well as a kind of literal pronunciation here. The idea of Ren, Chinese philosophy, particularly Confucianism, has developed the idea of Ren to include those beyond the immediate family and clan in the common good, and also reciprocal well-being to promote justifiable benefits for all. And in terms of morality and ethics for the rulers and the common people, Albert Chan argues that the idea of the common good is close to the Chinese social and political philosophy of Dadong, is the great unity or greater community or great harmony, is the Dadong, as found in the Confucian classics and the Dadong Su, the book of great community, written by Kang Yu-wei, is an early 20th century Chinese scholar. And according to Chan, Dadong in Confucian literature indicates the greater good in the contrast of Xiao Gang, that's the lesser good, and that in Dadong society, people care about all members of society and serve the common good instead of seeking primarily to the benefit themselves and their family. This is a society in which the Confucian virtue of Ren or benevolence is practiced beyond the immediate family. Chen argues that Kang's vision of a Dadong world is relevant to the contemporary context of socio-economic inequality and global capitalism. It embodied a credible vision of the common good in human society, and he puts forward Kang's concept of benevolence as a persuasive and coherent theoretical framework for the contemporary society beyond the Chinese society. Furthermore, Zhu Wang further argues that Ren is amongst highest goods in human society, since mutual caring and reciprocal networks are vital for mutual flourishing, and because mutual care plays an essential role in the transformation of society. Furthermore, examining the text of Mozi and Maoist philosophy of the 4th and 3rd BCE, Ellen Zhang argues that GOEI, the inclusive care, and also GOLI, is the reciprocal well-being, are the key concept in relation to the idea of common good, and provides a better understanding of the socio-political framework than Confucian philosophy. For GNI, Zhang argues that unlike Confucian philosophy, the Maoist approach moves from general to specific, and from impartial to the partial. In Maoism, the concept of community is wider and more abstract, and the principle of inclusiveness is higher and more transcendent ethics than that of filial piety. So there is various concepts of the Gongping, that's the justifiable equality, and Zhengni, that's the justifiable benefits, and also idea of righteousness, Zheng, and the Yi about justice, and the Gongni, that's the righteousness. The key concept for the Moji's philosophy was inclusiveness, and the common good was regarded not only as an independent good, but also as an interdependent good. This common good is achieved by the power of authority through the social and institutional contract, and political authority is a necessary condition for social order. So Chang concludes that the Moist concept of the good provides a more realistic notion of the social justice and fairness, since it is based on the rationality or principle rather than relying on relationships or personal contracts. The philosophical concept of Datong and Ren and in Confucianism, and also the inclusive care and reciprocal care, well-being in Moism seems to provide both conceptual and methodological insights for situations of inequality and injustice. In particular, Chinese sources stress that in order to achieve the goal of the common good, it is not enough to create a political system, nor rely on the people's goodwill. Instead, they advance a long-term strategy of building virtues that creates a sustainable society because it is in the interest of both ruler and ruled. Jennifer Fries sums up much of this discussion when he writes that the problem of minorities is among the most contested issues in political life because of competing desires for freedom and belonging, especially when it comes to the issues of equality and freedom. Freedom requires autonomy of action and promotes a variety of values, as well as innovation and diversity, whereas belonging requires certain constraints of freedom in order to maintain social relationships and social cohesion and preserve common identity and certain uniformity. The issue of minority rights is not only a matter of tolerance, but also of a positive government action to promote diversity and to affirm the dignity, esteem, and mutual respect of all citizens, whatever their religious, racial, linguistic, and ethnic identities. However, the above discussion of Western, Indian, and Chinese concepts also exhibits that in pursuit of a just society, the notion of the common good, tolerance, or structuring a political system for ensuring the care of the poor and marginalized are not sufficient. Two further elements are needed. First, the understanding of the common good, which benefits society as a whole and that pursues justice for minorities, is developed through citizenship and active participation of the public sphere. This is based on the notion that society is not a collection of individuals, but is a body with a shared common values and identities and mutual commitment. And that it requires a moral and religious active engagement in politics. The second element is the building of a character and virtue in citizens, because concept of justice and the common good are closely related to ethics and morality. Our discussion has shown the affinity of the philosophical discourse with the Christian theological concept of the dignity of human beings as created in the image of God, and solidarity with the poor and oppressed, and the prophetic advocacy in the public sphere. So here, I would like to turn to public theology for its perspective on the topics of minority rights and the common good. So my third section is public theology applied to minority rights. In his discussion of mainline Protestants, evangelical and Catholic churches in the USA, Martin Marty suggested that together they form a public theology which holds distinctive resources to respond to the challenge of what he identifies as a crisis of morale and mission. He defines public church as a family of apostolic churches with Jesus Christ at the center, which are especially sensitive to the state, to the public order, and the surrounds and includes public faith. Since it is made up of several different confessions, he also describes the public church as a communion of communions, distinguished and yet sharing a common Christian vocation. Marty contrasts his vision of public church with the other ways in which the religious religions organize themselves. There are three kinds of churches he criticizes. One is a totalist, which means a theocentric approach, and tribalist, excludes and self-interest approach, and the privalist is an individualistic approach. Public theology then becomes, in Marty's view, an effort to interpret the life of a people in the light of transcendent reference. Doing public theology or being public church is to exhibit commitment to relate public and private faith to public order. The public church recognizes that it shares traditions, visions, aspects of enlightenment, civil purpose, and transacting philosophies with the many of the constitutions and the collegia in the larger civil order. It's a bit too warm, I think. Yeah. The public church contributes to the public discourse out of its own particular revelation and the principles it has developed. Although Marty tends to be over-optimistic about the role of the church in the public life of the USA, Marty's idea of public church and its relationship with the politics and society is helpful and has certainly made a significant impact on the discussion of public theology. He argues historically that each of the three traditions, that is, mainline Protestant, evangelical church, and Catholic churches, has inherently public theologies which have influenced US society over several centuries. Public theology was prominent, especially in the evangelical revivals and in the social gospel movement. But particularly since 1960s, especially, public theologies that have been influential globally include Catholic social teaching and statement on social and political issues by the ecumenical movement and the Black theology of the civil rights movement. It has also been prevalent in discussion of religious pluralism and in the Black and feminist theologies in recent years. In the 1980s, the challenge of peace, God's promise, and our response, and also economic justice for all, that's the two pastoral letters, triggered a much discussion within the church and academy on the issue of civil discourse and the ways and means to engage in public life. The dominant themes of public theology in the USA in this period were the role of theology in a democratic polity, and Christian social vision and political liberalism. So in this period, the dominant theme was the role of Christianity in the democratic society, Christian social vision, and political liberalism, the significance of church-related social institutions, and the relationship of theological resources to the global economy. So for the discussion on justice for the poor and minorities, public theology draws its argument from the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and Christian traditions, and other various sources, as I mentioned. From this, we can glance to four main insights to the help in our discussion. First, according to Gerard Fonrad, examining the prophetic tradition, quote, there is absolutely no concept in the Old Testament with so central a significance for all the relationships of human life as that of justice. It is the standard not only for man's relationship to God, but also for his relationship to his fellows, the highest value in life, that upon which all life rests when it is properly ordered, unquote. In Christianity and Democracy, John Deckruch distinguished the democratic system, which is constitutional principle and procedures, and the democratic vision, which is the hope for society of equality, freedom, and justice. So in his view, the Christianity helped the system, but Christianity especially contributed decisively to the shaping of the democratic vision throughout its witness to the message of the Hebrew prophets. In order to establish a just world order, which he sees as an ultimate vision for Christianity, John Deckruch argues that the prophetic tradition and vision for social justice for oppressed, poor, and other victims of society, so that all people are equally respected as bearers of God's image. The God of Israel is consistently seen as a God of justice, and his people ought to be just. And the prophetic tradition demonstrated that justice is an ultimate theological concern, and not only an ultimate moral concern, as they will never insist. And second, the justice is not an equal treatment of all members of the society. As Walter Jimmelli argues, justice in the Hebrew Bible is never blind justitia. It is always understood as an aspect of open-eyed compassion, divine demand for compassion towards the weak and the poor. And Christopher Marshall describes a Christian understanding of justice as a compassionate justice. Thus, the scripture does not provide a comprehensive theory of justice, but seeking justice is of vital importance, and the scriptures encourages Christians to understand why we should seek justice and how we should understand seeking justice for these minorities and poor. So the importance of why and how is the concern for the scripture writers. Here, the concept of justice in the Hebrew Bible is different from philosophical concept in that it is never an abstract discourse on the nature of justice, but it insists that conditions of the poor and marginalized are under the unjust structure. And justice in the Christian scripture has always been interpreted as the taking care of the victims of unjustice system, including minorities, weak, and oppressed. And third, Justice is understood as a natural outcome of right relationship with God. In his discussion of Christianity and social justice, Duncan Forrester acknowledges the importance of John Rawls' works. He saw that John Rawls gave a great importance to justice, as in the Bible, and justice is what holds together a decent society. And secondly, Rawls affirms and assumes human equality, which is deeply rooted in Judeo-Christian tradition. And thirdly, Rawls' different principles of concepts concern for the least advantage is like the preferential option for the poor of the liberation theology. And then finally, Rawls makes fairness as the key component in justice. However, he further argues that if justice is the first virtue of social institutions, it must be more than fairness. And for Christians, justice is more than fairness. In particular, in Judeo-Christian tradition, justice is understood in relational terms. It is about the proper structure of relationships between God and people and among human beings, and it is primarily and pervasively social. And justice is not a virtue or equality which an individual can have in isolation, but a quality of relationship. The sense of obligation, responsibility, and care that binds people together in society. And justice and righteousness have to interact with each other. And fourth point, the importance of Christian praxis is a key aspect of Christian understanding of justice. Edward Schillebeeckx, a Dutch theologian, was attentive to critical theory in his theology. And Schillebeeckx emphasized that the theory and action should come together to enhance the transformation of society, and that the two should mutually inform each other. Schillebeeckx saw that the purely theoretical and philosophical hermeneutics was untenable because understanding can be severely frustrated by social and political structures. And in order to link Christian understanding of faith with social and political existence, Schillebeeckx argued that the knowledge is determined by the interest of the inner bond of praxis and theory, and that the former determines the latter. And in this sense, theology must be the critical theory of the praxis of faith, and the relationship with the praxis forms the inseparable parts of the whole doing theology. So on the basis of above emphasis on social justice for the poor and marginalized, public theology emphasizes the common good for its methodology, as well as the goal of just social order for all. So my final point, public theology and the common good. In his discussion of Christianity and democracy, again, John De Cruci sees the common good as a binding members of society together in mutual accountability and as a process rather than a static set of principles. He argues that it is a necessary vision of a just social order which challenges individualism and promotes the welfare and fulfillment of society as a whole. He insists that the doctrine of common good will provide an important challenge to the possessive individualism, which lies at the heart of liberal democratic capitalism, and to the sacrifice of human rights by social collectivism. He points out that the relationship between power and powerlessness has always been a struggle for democratic theory, and that the church's role is important in keeping those who are in power accountable, and at the same time, empowering those who are weak to exercise their rights for the good of the whole society. He challenges notion that the democratic system will somehow produce morally responsible citizens as a matter of course. Rather, he says that it is a morally formed and empowered who are able to make democracy work. So in terms of public issues of economic and political life in a natural and global setting, Catholic social teaching has been immensely influential on the Catholic communities and beyond, and the concept of the common good is at the very heart of his principle. In the most comprehensive document of Catholic social teaching, the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, published in 2007, the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace identified the common good as one of the 4 key principles of the Church's social doctrine, along with human dignity, subsidiarity, and solidarity. The compendium expands the meaning and primary implication of the common good as follows, quote, "The principle of the common good to which every aspect of social life must be related if it is to action to attain its fullest meaning, stems from the dignity, unity, and equality of all people. The common good does not consist in the simple sum of the particular goods of each subject of a social entity. Belonging to everyone and to each person, it is and remains common because it is invisible and because only together it is possible to attain it, increase it, and safeguard its effectiveness with regard also to the future," unquote. Furthermore, PCJP insists on the common good as a primary goal of a society and that it has to be achieved together, and it is closely connected to the notion of respect for and integral promotion of fundamental rights. It also asserts that the raison d'etre of the political authority is to further the common good, and that states must ensure the common good by keeping the requirements of justice for individuals and groups within the state. In his discussion of common good, the Catholic ethicist David Hollenbach acknowledged that there is a skepticism about the compatibility of a shared vision of the good life in relation to freedom of individuals, especially in the US politics. The very nature of plural society lies in the fact that people do not agree with each other, and in a political arrangement of tolerance cannot handle the complexity of the conflicting good and justice for each community. Along with Sander, he calls for the forming of public philosophy, which combines commitment to the common good with respect for the equality and freedom of all members of relevant communities. He sees justice as a prerequisite for the common good, in that the socio-political system cannot rely on people's goodwill, but it has to have justice with the solidarity toward the poor and marginalized built-in. Hollenbach sees the importance of the strengthening of the commutative justice, by which it means the reciprocal in exchange among the individuals, for example, wage justice, protection of contracts, and so on. But he insists that a more comprehensive system of justice is required. He argues for the 3 types of justice. One is contributive or general justice, which means the contribution to the common good that justice requires for the individual people. All citizens have duty to help build up of this aspect of social life. And secondly, distributive justice, which means the way members of society share in the goods that their life together makes possible. And thirdly, social justice, the basic structure of society, which connects contributive and distributive justice. As will be apparent, Catholic social teaching arrives at many of the same conclusions about the common good and minority rights, although it draws on a different range of the sources and uses a different method. As you have discussed above, although there are various interpretations of the meaning of the common good, there is some consensus among the church leaders and theologians from the different traditions. First, the purpose of the state or government is the pursuit of the common good. And second, the concept rejects the extremes of individualism and collectivism, otherwise liberal democracy and social democracy, and tries to bring the good of individual and the good of community together. And the third, the common good is regarded as a comprehensive means to organize political life, regardless of political orientations. The importance of the distinction between the common good and public order when it comes to the relationship between law and morality in dealing with the personal behavior seems to be a key issue for practical implementation of the common good. Fourth, the common good implies the challenge from the utilitarian approach of a majoritarian view for the greater happiness of the greater number. It also encourages that the principle that no one should be sacrificed for the sake of the state and for the good of majority. In order to achieve fairness or the common good, it is envisaged that the politics of consensus be used to reach maximum agreement toward the advantage of all such, and in the case of the rule of the law. And fifth, seeking the common good requires parties to persuade communality and relationship. This is more than sums of individual benefits, which is an assumption of welfare state, and more than seeking the good of the shared culture and intrinsic values, which is rooted in the human nature. And sixth, and finally, the common good has to be understood not as an idea which can be readily defined, but rather as a set of responsibilities pertaining to a shared project of which we are all our parties, humanities, share the project of living together. It is regarded as not predetermined, but rather conditions the participation of all for the good of all. Such an understanding of common good brings together systematic, cultural, and moral arguments in the interest of protecting minority interests and works against majoritarianism in the democratic society. Now, I would like to conclude that now. There are problems of understanding of the common good, such as the questions of how to protect of individual rights while seeking the common good, of who should define the common good within the modern plural and secular state, and who says so, on what ground, and whose interest. Nevertheless, the theology of common good provides alternative approaches to the problem of minorities and makes possible meaningful conversation between liberal democracy and socialist democracy. It is also able to engage philosophies such as those from China and India, which pay great attention to cultural and virtue solutions than those of the modern Western have done. The theology of common good is based on the concept of dignity of human beings, which is grounded in the biblical understanding of human beings as created in the image of God. In order to contribute to promote this dignity, any democratic state should provide mechanisms for the equality and freedom of individuals and create community for the maximum consensus for the common good. In particular, theologians of public theology sees the problem of majoritarianism as situated in the question of monopoly, particularly of the state and market. They advocate the active public engagement of different individuals, groups, and institutions to see that the welfare of the minorities is adequately addressed in a sustainable way. They are utilizing philosophical and political understanding of the importance of public engagement, together with a commitment to universal access and critical debate, to deal with the problem of minorities. On the one hand, they call for the state to acknowledge the vital importance of involving minorities in decision-making, and on the other hand, they urge religious communities to be open and active in social, political, and economic issues pertaining to all and not narrowly focused on their own sectarian interest in society. By doing this, public theologians try to bridge between secular and sacred understandings of contemporary issues. One way of doing this is to bring the tradition of wisdom of Hebrew Bible into wider society in a way that interacts with both secular and sacred resources to address issues and seeks for common solutions to strengthen the statecraft of the democracy. Public theology utilizes advocacy, public debate, and campaigns, and works with the civil societies on various issues, such as poverty and social welfare in policymaking. However, it is difficult for public theology to make theological insights heard in secular society, and he has a limited expertise on the various issues. Public theologians may end up creating weak public, which serves to satisfy religious communities for their social obligations, but in reality does not make any of the significant changes and transformation they seek to achieve. The key issue for the public theology is its stance for the minorities and bringing religious insights and resources into the public discussion without being either too exclusive or too inclusive. For those who are doing public theology, there is a clear requirements for a theological, philosophical, and practical rationale and methodology for the furtherance of this approach and for the creative engagement in the public and issues of minorities. Freedom, equality, and the rule of law are indeed key aspirations for the modern nation states, which enable human society to flourish. But society must also deal with the problem of minorities, and this is not just a matter of tolerance, compassion, or charity from the majority, or from those who have authority, wealth, and power. But the system has to provide the least of these. As Hollenbach convincingly argues, the choice today is not between freedom and community, but between a society based on reciprocal respect and solidarity and a society that leaves many people behind. And this choice will have a powerful effect on the well-being of us all. Thank you.